Namaskar. Welcome to Discourse number 30. In this discourse, let's examine the third source of klesha, that is Raga. In the Sadhana Pada of Yoga Sutras, Patanjali defines what Raga is in Sutra number 7. It goes like this: Sukhanusai Raga. Look at this sutra, contains only 3 words: Sukha, Anusai, and Raga. Sukha means pleasure or happiness. Anusai means accompanying. Raga means attraction. Attraction is pleasure accompanied. In other words, attraction is accompanied by pleasure. So pleasure, where there is a pleasure, there is raga. Or where there is attraction, this attraction gives us pleasure. And this pleasure in turn gives us pain. So where there is raga, there is klesha. This is the implication of this sutra. But then, if you go deep into this sutra, you find only 3 words. That is sukha. Sukha means pleasure. But this pleasure, how we derive this pleasure? When we come into contact with certain objects and things in the outside world, they in turn stimulate our sense organs. And this stimulation may be emotional or physical or related to mind. And when we derive that kind of stimulation, that stimulation is called pleasure. But there are sensual pleasure and sensuous pleasure. These two need to be distinguished. Sensual pleasure has a gratifying carnal, in the sense it has erotic connotations, sexual connotations. Whereas sensuous is something that is related to senses, physical, emotional and mental. Similarly, the pleasure should also be distinguished from happiness, though both are used synonymously, but there are some differences between these two. Pleasure is short-lived, whereas happiness is long-lived, in the sense that happiness is not permanent, because where there is happiness, there is bound to be sorrow. Where there is pleasure, there is bound to be pain. When the speaker says the pleasure is short-lived and happiness is long-lived, he means that happiness lasts little longer than pleasure. That is all. It's not eternal. It's not to be understood in that eternal sense. Similarly, pleasure is something connected to our physical senses, but happiness is purely an inward condition. It is an inner condition. Similarly, pleasure is it is in taking. Pleasure is in taking, whereas happiness is giving. Because whatever we derive is called a pleasure, something that stimulates us. So stimulation is pleasure, whereas happiness is giving. Happiness is sharing. In giving and in sharing there is happiness. Similarly, pleasure is achieved with the substances, whereas happiness cannot be achieved with substances. Again, there is another difference between these two, that pleasure is achieved while being alone, whereas happiness is achieved in social groups. So these are the differences between pleasure and happiness. So they are two different words, though they are used synonymously, but there exist differences between these two, and these two should not be mistaken. One should not be mistaken for the other. Similarly, when we say this pleasure is something related to our sense organs. So the sense organs undergo some kind of stimulation. This stimulation gives us some kind of satisfaction. So where there is an element of satisfaction, we need more satisfaction. Satisfaction breeds satisfaction. So pleasure breeds pleasure. There is no end for this pleasure, because the amount of satisfaction that we derive from our contact with the objective world may not be enough for us. So we want more, we crave more. So therefore we will be in pursuit of that sense of pleasure. So pleasure breeds pleasure. Now this pleasure is of three kinds: emotional pleasure, physical pleasure, and intellectual pleasure, mental pleasure. Now we look at how we are wedded to the outside objective world, and also the inner ideas that we form. As we are wedded to these objective world and inner ideas, we derive some sense of pleasure because they give us some sort of stimulation, and therefore we want more and more such pleasure, and we run after such pleasures, right? As we run after such pleasures, they result in pain. Say, for instance, there is the pleasure of wealth. In this pleasure of wealth, this is something related to physical pleasure. In this pleasure of wealth, we earn some money today, and we are not satisfied with it, and therefore, that non-satisfaction provokes us to pursue more. So tomorrow we earn something more. We double what we have earned today. And again we are not satisfied with it, so we again pursue, and this pursuit is endless. In this way the wealth is multiplied, and we pursue this money and wealth. But this is endless, and this kind of chasing after money and wealth, and at one point this money and wealth which is chased by us will chase us in turn. So then we get all kinds of physical disorders, diseases, and so on. So this kind of mad pursuit after money and wealth results in physical disorder. Similarly, there is what is called the pleasure of power. Now, this pleasure of power is derived from not being satisfied with power. Say, as long as we are in power, we feel very happy. Once we are deprived of that power, we almost become panic, we become mad. And because that power gives us certain perks, certain benefits, certain extra material benefits. So these extra benefits, these extra perks make us crave for that power. Look at how people in the universities and government organizations fight for positions over seniority, right? So this mad race for power is something that is related to emotional play, because power gives us emotional pleasure. Therefore, when we are deprived of that power, when we are out of that power, then we become almost mad. And how we fight for this power, to regain this power. And this kind of mad pursuit after power also results in physical disorders, right? And then there is a pleasure of knowledge. Look at how we are wedded to the information in the world. We are not satisfied with what we learn today. So we keep on learning and learning more and more information, and we stop this mind with more and more information. So knowledge breeds knowledge. So knowledge also gives a sense of pleasure, and we are not satisfied with the amount of knowledge that we learn, acquire today. So we also pursue endlessly this knowledge, since the knowledge that gives us some kind of stimulation. So knowledge gives us some excitement, it entertains us because it is informative, and there is a newness in that learning, and therefore we run after that, and that newness gives us some sense of pleasure, and therefore we crave for more and more such knowledge. Similarly, there is a pleasure of ideas and thoughts. Now, sometimes we are also fascinated by ideas and thoughts, or ideologies and beliefs, and we develop a deep attachment to such ideas and thoughts, such beliefs and ideologies, and we live in such ideologies, in such ideas and thoughts and beliefs, and we look at the world through such ideas and thoughts and beliefs and ideologies. And that is why you see in the world our ideas and thoughts, our ideological affiliations, our associations with beliefs come into conflict with other man's association or affiliation with ideologies, beliefs, ideas and thoughts. This is how the world is functioning. So these ideas, this association with ideas and thoughts, ideologies and beliefs will also give us some sense of pleasure, right? And then there is also pleasure of objects and things. See how in our day-to-day life we develop some attachments to things and objects. See how we cannot live even for a minute without mobile, right? Similarly, we are attached to the television, we are attached to the gold, jewelry, and so on and so forth. and remove these things and objects, we almost go mad. So, because they give us some sense of pleasure, they stimulate us. Although mobile has its own functional element, but we go beyond this functional element. We see some kind of element of pleasure that it gives us. Therefore, we constantly hold the mobile and keep on meddling with it, right? So most young people do this, right? Most young people cannot live without mobile because you see how they use the mobile in traveling, in buses, trains, how they keep on watching films and other videos endlessly, because this gives them some sort of stimulation, some pleasure. And where there is an element of pleasure, it breeds more pleasure. It makes you crave for more, and therefore we develop some attachment to such objects and things. So this is another kind of pleasure. And then there is also pleasure of fame and recognition. We gain some kind of goodwill in the society, right, among certain people, and that goodwill gives us some satisfaction. So we go for more goodwill. So we try for that. So this fame, this goodwill, recognition gives us some stimulation. Therefore, we pursue these ideas, this fame, this recognition, this goodwill in the society. Then we have a pleasure of piety. Now, this pleasure of piety is in contrast with the pleasures that we derive from objects and things and ideas and thoughts and ideologies and so on, so forth. This pleasure of piety is something related to our adherence to certain religious beliefs. So we live in certain religion. All of us identify ourselves with some religion or the other, and these religions impose certain rules and regulations, certain norms, certain values, and certain customs and practices. And we all follow these customs and practices and observe festivals and so on and so forth. And they give in turn certain pleasure. So this is called pleasure of piety. And then there is a pleasure of memory. This pleasure of memory, some time ago in the past, we may have undergone certain pleasurable experiences, and those pleasurable experiences get recorded in the subconscious state. So the memory is a powerful storehouse from which we may recall such experiences. So we may become nostalgic sometimes. So those recorded pleasurable experiences, when they are recalled, they provoke more pleasure, more stimulation. So we become more and more nostalgic. Similarly, we have a pleasure of imagination. Now, this imagination is nothing but living in fantasies, because we create something more real than the real world. Certain images, and these images give us certain sense of pleasure. So therefore, we develop some attachment to this. So we dabble in fantasy and imagination, and then we also have a pleasure of expectation, anticipation. So we expect certain things to happen according to our estimate, according to our wishes, according to our will, right? And we anticipate, even before we perform certain action, we anticipate. And even after performing certain action, we expect something to happen. So we constantly live in a hope, and that hope is related to future. We always live in future, and this living in future, living in hope gives us some kind of sensation, some kind of pleasure. So this is called pleasure of expectation or anticipation and so on. Now there is another kind of pleasure. This pleasure is pleasure of dependency or association. So we depend on several people, correct? And they act like clutches. So remove these clutches, we almost become mad. Look at how we develop deep attachment, physical, emotional, intellectual attachment to certain people, and with whom we share everything. And when they are there with us, we derive some pleasure, because we are deeply attached to those people, emotionally attached, like in a family, how a husband is emotionally attached to his wife, or wife is emotionally attached to her husband, and how parents are emotionally attached to their children, and children are emotionally attached to their parents, and so on and so forth. This dependency also creates some sensation of pleasure. We derive some pleasure, and therefore we are wedded to these people. We develop this kind of attachment to these people. So we have these various kinds of pleasures that we derive from various sources we have just now examined. But what Patanjali says, where there is an element of pleasure, because a pleasure comes out of attachment. Pleasure creates attachment, right? And pleasure breeds more pleasure. Satisfaction breeds more satisfaction. And where there is a pleasure, there is bound to be pain. So this is how the raga, that is attraction. Raga means attraction, and where there is attraction, the attraction gives us some stimulation, some sensational experience, which in turn get recorded, which in turn also turn into a desire, and therefore we crave for more such pleasure. So this kind of attraction also creates more attachment, and where there is attachment, there is pain. So this is what raga means. Raga means attraction, and this attraction, we are attracted to the world, to the objective world, to the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, ideologies, and so on and so forth. So, and when we develop this deep sense of attachment to such ideas and thoughts, or to the entire objective world, then it results in pain. So this is the essence of what raga is. This is how raga emanates. This is how raga creates its profound influence on our body, on our vital aspect of this being, and on our mind too. Therefore, we have physical, emotional, and intellectual attractions. All these attractions create pain. They create pleasure first, and where there is pleasure, there is pain. Because, as we have just now learned, pleasure breeds more pleasure. So when it demands more pleasure, we run after that pleasure. So we madly pursue that pleasure, and therefore we develop all kinds of physical, emotional, and intellectual disorders. Namaskar. We shall meet in the next discourse.